Okay, welcome everyone to another episode of Singing Brain. I'm really excited to introduce our guest today. Haley Kragness is an assistant professor of psychology at Bucknell University. She is interested in how we learn musical patterns implicitly as we grow and how we harness musical learning to have socially and emotionally meaningful experiences. She has published numerous papers with a focus on children's psychology and music. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to chat with you.
Awesome. So to start out, tell us how you got interested in this field.
Sure. I was a musician growing up. I think many of the people who end up in this field have a similar story to that. And so I had quite a lot of experience, personal experience, with the power and engaging aspects of music that I found as a child. When I was actually in high school, I came home one day after school and my mom had bought a book for me that she thought just stuck out to her as something I would like. And it was Musicophilia by Oliver Sacks. And so if you don't already know who Oliver Sacks is, he recently passed a few years ago, but he was a really prominent clinician who spent much of his time with patients who had really atypical presentation of neurological disorders. I think his other, quite famous book is The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat. But this book was about his experiences with patients who had presentations or symptoms that were related to experiences with music. So one of the chapters, for example, is named Papa Blows His Nose in G. So all of a sudden, someone who hadn't been so musical to begin with, all of a sudden had perfect pitch and was,
Right.
really, all of a sudden became really interested and engaged in music. And so I ate that book up. It was really excited me. It never occurred to me that we could look at music in a scientific way. Mm-hmm. So that was really what piqued my interest. But it didn't occur to me that this could be a career that people have. So as I journeyed through my undergraduate work, I gravitated towards psychology classes and towards music classes. There was no such thing as music cognition or music perception at the university that I was at for my undergraduate education. So I just kind of cobbled together those classes on my own, got a psych major, got a music minor. And as I became more and more interested in the field, would gravitate towards, when I have to read a paper for class, I'll find a music paper. And that's what introduced me to all the people in the field who you're speaking to,
right.
Podcast. And so that really sparked my interest and led me to pursue this as a career.
That is definitely the common thread in all of these interviews is that people were interested in music, they were interested in psychology or neuroscience, and they didn't know that there was this amazing intersection between them and that music can really have a profound effect on psychology and music. And so it's really cool hearing about the moment when people realize oh, wait, this is something that I can study and I can have a career in.
Yeah, we are very, very lucky that we get to come to work every day and think about such interesting things.
Totally, absolutely. So, you hear people call someone musical. Oh, this person is very musical, or they have musicality. What do those terms mean to you and in your research?
Yeah, that's a really, really great question. I think when we colloquially think about musicality, at least in our culture here in the US, we often think of people who are really good performers.
Yep.
But my perspective is that we're all a lot more musical than we think we are. even if we've never taken any music lessons in our whole life. So, people are terrified to go and sing karaoke, of course, obviously in front of people.
Great, nerve-wracking.
People will say, oh, I'm a terrible, terrible singer. But everyone can sing Happy Birthday, and that's kind of a hard song to sing.
Yeah, true.
In it. And we use music throughout our lives. Like we use music to pump ourselves up before a big game, to relax ourselves at night, to sing along, to, I don't know, wagon wheel.
Right.
With everyone else around you, and most of us can engage in those behaviors perfectly well, perfectly adequately. And so we reach a level of proficiency with our musical vocabulary of our culture, that enables us to use music in all of these sophisticated ways in our life, basically every single day, right? And so to me, that's what really is characterizing musicality. It's this suite of underlying sort of psychological, motor, social capacities that all come together to allow us to use music in our daily lives. So that's what musicality is to me.
That makes perfect sense to me. And you have a particular interest in children and children's psychology. What was your draw to that age group and music's effect on children?
I did not start out as someone interested in child development. So I went into graduate work thinking I was really going to focus on adult cognition. And I was really interested in, at that time, I was primarily interested in how we learn pitch patterns. So certain chords or certain pitches are more likely at the end of a song, for example, than others, right? If we're listening to a song in C major, it's more likely to end on a C than it is on a B natural. And so these are really like patterns that we have to learn through exposure to music. And again, you don't have to be able to say, oh, that was a C in C major to know that it sounds good, right? And so that was where I was coming from. That was what I was really interested in. And I found quite a lot of similarities between formally trained musicians and non-musicians in this capacity, right? So that sort of suggests that it's something we learn along the way as we grow. And as I started to think about that more, I realized, oh, if I want to know where this comes from, I need to look earlier. And so that's what really led me to start thinking about what was going on in infancy and childhood, some of these really early experiences with music that lead to these really powerful learning experiences that we carry with us.
Totally. And I think it's interesting you said, people may not know what C major is, but it sounds good. I think about the same thing with like major and minor keys. People know that it sounds happy or it sounds sad, but they don't necessarily have the terminology, but it feels sort of like innate to humans to understand certain musical, things that go on in music. So it makes sense that you'd go back all the way to kids to see when this really starts.
Yeah, and I think what's really interesting, like another layer of this is what you said, it feels innate, right? It feels really intuitive to us.
Right.
But actually major and minor are constructs that we have in our musical culture, but don't exist in other musical cultures.
Totally, yeah.
And so because of that, we must learn them along the way, right? They're not innate. So if they're not innate, then where does it come? Into our experience. So that's kind of the questions that I've been focusing on.
Which is actually a perfect segue to my next question, which is so from your research, what developmental stage or age do you think music starts to take this impact that you were talking about?
Yeah, it depends on what you mean by impact. So we know that as early as the third trimester, a lot of the hardware, we could say, is prepared for auditory processing. And so that's kind of consistent with what pregnant people say about their experiences of activity that they perceive as in response to sounds in the environment, right? For their fetus. And there appear to be some cognitive capacities that are available to the fetus as well. So, for example, some of the classic studies from a few decades ago showed that if you repeated the same poem or the same song to a fetus in the third trimester, and then tested as a newborn whether they recognized it, they could differentiate between the one they heard over and over and over in the womb and another poem. I think they did The Cat in the Hat and The Dog in the Fog. And then there's other things that we know fetuses can detect as well. So, for example, rhythm. They can differentiate between the rhythm of speech of the language that their mother is speaking while they're in the womb, or the parent who's carrying them, from another person speaking a different language that has a different rhythmic structure. So we have some of those capacities really, really early. But obviously the environment that the fetus is in is not conducive to a lot of the other things that we think of as being part of our musical experience. So yes, they have, the auditory and some cognitive capacities to perceive music. But is it anything like the music that we experience? Probably not. They don't have another whole suite of abilities and experiences to support that, right? So I think one of the interesting things about looking at development is that we need to consider development in many different domains in order to try to understand what music experiences are like at that time. So probably the development of language has a really important role at certain points, but not others, right? If language isn't as important, if you can't understand words, then that's not going to impact your experience of the music, versus if you can understand the words. If you can synchronize your movements to the beat, if you have that motor capacity, that might change the way that you're able to engage with it. If you have theory of mind, for example, that might change your experience of music. And all of these things come online at different times in development. And so one's experience of music as you move through those developmental stages is probably quite different.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense, especially during critical periods and developmental periods. Our mindset shifts a lot about many different things. So it makes sense that music would go along with that, and our experience listening or playing music would change drastically from stage to stage.
It's hard to imagine that, though, I think, as adults.
Absolutely, yeah.
We're just as we're sort of human-centric and ethnocentric,
right? We're
also kind of adult-centric. It's hard to think about what an experience so unlike our own might be like.
Totally. And we don't remember so it's hard to draw on any sort of experience.
Exactly.
Well, that's really fascinating work. My final question is, and my favorite question to ask, are there any interesting stories or findings that you've encountered that you would like to share?
Well, I can tell you a little bit about a study that we recently finished up. That's one of my favorites that we ever ran. The work isn't yet peer reviewed. It's currently under peer review, so we have to take it with a grain of salt. But it was a super fun study to run. So we were really interested in the differences between experiencing music live versus experiencing a recorded playback of music. And this has been a burgeoning sort of area of research in the past decade or so, as we've moved as a field from studying like sine tones in headphones to being like, okay, that's not really the musical experience. What happens when we bring it in a concert hall? And our technologies have changed to enable us to do that.
Sure.
So that has been a general trend in the field. And especially now, like I think with the pandemic, that question of like, what is the difference between
Mm-hmm.
a live versus a recorded rendition really, really hits home to people now, I think.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So we kind of lucked out because we ran this study right before the pandemic.
Oh, wow. Good timing.
Yeah, and you'll see why for a second. So we brought audiences of babies and parents into a concert hall.
Okay.
We got to use this really special facility at McMaster University, which is in Hamilton, Ontario. It's called the Live Lab.
Cool.
And it's a really cool facility that's designed specifically to be a concert hall that you can run highly controlled scientific studies in. So it was designed by a scientist in collaboration with audio engineers and musicians and such. And so it's a really cool and unique place. So we brought 30 families at a time to watch a baby opera. There's a local musician, Brina Berezowska, who composed this opera for babies. She called it the Music Box.
Wow.
And we did 2 shows of 30 audience members each, baby audience members plus their parents. So,
right.
Quite a big crowd.
Yeah.
And we measured their attention. In front of every single baby, there was an iPad where we could record where they were looking, their facial expressions and such. And then for some of the babies, we also recorded their heart rate using electrophysiological sensors.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we have this audience of babies. Then in November, we brought in new audiences of babies the same age, and played back a life-size recording of the performance the other babies had seen. So now they're matched in like how the size, the social setting, the place, the concert hall, everything was exactly the same, except the performer couldn't respond to the audience members in a dynamic way. They were just seeing the playback of the performance the other babies had seen. Mm-hmm. And again, we measured their attention, we measured their heart rate, and our preliminary results really suggest that, first of all, the live performance engaged babies' attention more than the playback.
Okay.
So that's pretty validating. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Another really exciting thing that we found was the correlations between the heart rate of audience members, the baby audience members, was more correlated or more similar across time in the live performance than the recorded performance.
Okay.
So how do you explain this?
Right.
A lot of the stimulus properties are sort of the same, right? And so the way that we are thinking about it, and the question that we're kind of trying to build off of is, maybe the performer is able to micro adjust her performance in response to the audience in such a way that it harnesses their attention and harnesses their sort of physiological responses, their emotional responses.
Sure.
And I think that sort of anecdotally matches with what performers say that they do when they're, some performers anyway, some say, I don't pay attention to the audience, but many performers say that they're sensitive to audience responses.
Absolutely.
And so now we're trying to test this in a more controlled way, the specific hypothesis about responsiveness. So we're doing a Zoom study where one-on-one, a performer plays to a baby across Zoom. So now they're both on a screen. And in another condition, another set of babies will get the playback that a different baby saw, right? So now they're both on screen, one-on-one. One is live and can be responsive, the other can't be, right? So is it the screen that was doing this, or was it the liveness? Was it the interaction? Okay. And so that's what we're really trying to get at and build off of that. So I'm excited about that line of research. I think that's a really interesting to me.
Yeah, it's super interesting. And it's a huge, it's really cool that you got to do such a large scale study. in that setting. I mean, especially the timing was perfect, obviously.
Yes.
But it's amazing that you got all these babies together and their parents, and you got a professional singer and I just, yeah, or a professional composer. I think that's really interesting, interesting research, and I'm sure
it was
up and coming.
quite the undertaking.
I can't imagine. I mean, having, what did you say, 30 babies in one room, that has to be a huge responsibility.
It was super fun though.
Yeah, it sounds it. Well, thank you so much for being with us. I won't take up more of your time, but thank you for sharing your unique perspective and your research. It's really fascinating to hear about all of these up and coming topics, and I can't wait to read that paper. That's really exciting.
Thanks. It was an absolute pleasure to speak with you.